So there's a connection there between the contemporary far right and the Zionists, and it makes complete sense. If you want to oppose the Palestinians, Islamophobia is one of the best weapons to do that.
Welcome back to a brand new season of The Tea with me, Myriam Francois. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe so that you never miss an episode of The Tea. If you want exclusive content and to help shape future shows, you can also join our Patreon community. Think of it as the Resistance. The link's in our bio. Today, we are unpacking the Unite the Kingdom March, the largest far-right rally in British history, held here in London this month. Organised by far-right activist and convicted criminal Tommy Robinson, the event drew over 110,000 people and featured speakers from an international far-right network stretching from the US to France and New Zealand. Elon Musk made an appearance declaring violence is coming to you and urging Britons to quote-unquote fight back or die. The rally portrayed itself as a crusade to reclaim Britain from Muslims and migrants, with supporters chanting, "Get them out," and calls to overthrow the government. This followed a summer marked by a surge in anti-immigrant protests, mosque attacks and racist graffiti, echoing the riots sparked by Robinson and his cohort last summer after they spread disinformation. So why did this rally happen? Why was an American tech billionaire backing a petty criminal largely seen as a fringe racist in Britain? And why were protesters carrying Israeli flags? What does this mix of British nationalist, Trumpist, and pro-Israel symbolism tell us about those truly behind it? To help unpack all of this, I'm joined by award-winning journalist and historian Taj Ali. Known for his sharp commentary on class inequality and South Asian political activism, and former editor of Tribune, he also grew up in the same town as Tommy Robinson. That's Luton. If you believe everything you read on X, it's a Sharia-only zone where white people are banned. Fake news courtesy of Musk and company. Taj, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So first off, I want to ask you about Tommy Robinson, which is, of course, not his real name. What's his rep like in Luton? Because obviously you're both from the same town. I'm guessing that locals in Luton may know a little bit about this man.
Stephen Yaxley Lennon, he was very involved in football hooliganism. He's got quite a track record of criminal activity. And he has a script that he goes through whenever he goes on these podcasts, and they get millions of views, and people who don't know who Mr. Yaxley Lennon is, who don't know what Luton is like, they'll believe a lot of it. This is a guy, white working class lad who had to look down, who was targeted by Muslims, and he's depicted the town, which is a working class town, which does have problems, as a place where Muslims are running the town, and if you're white, you're being attacked and you're being targeted. And that is not the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is, in fact, when the English Defence League were a thing, you had white working class people standing up against the EDL, because when you live in a multicultural community, you don't see colour. You treat individuals as individuals. You'll see bad people within the black community, Asian community, white community. You'd see good people in those communities. I mean, the road I grew up on, I've got an Irish neighbour, West Indian neighbour, Somali neighbour, and we all get on. We've all got on for over 20 years. And that's the reality that you will never get. And I think what he's done is he's played on the anxieties of people that live in predominantly white areas, and he portrays multiculturalism as a horror story. And that's not the reality on the ground. I mean, he talks about Muslim drug dealers and Muslim criminals. Look into his past, look into his own links, and then tell us who's causing problems. He's never been about fixing problems in Luton. He's never been about solutions. Yes, we had some extremists. They were booted out the mosques. Yes, we had some far-right extremists. They were booted out the town. They can't stand living with black and Asian people, so they don't even live in Luton anymore. So yes, we have many problems. I think we've often been depicted as a town with really bad town centre, with a lack of opportunity, but that's the story of a lot of places across Britain. It's a working class town that once had thriving industries. The Vauxhall factory, which has just closed down, used to employ tens of thousands of people. My dad was one of them. And that's the story of immigration to Luton. And if you worked at the Vauxhall factory, you would have Irish people, Pakistani people, West Indian people on the same assembly lines. They would have hockey clubs, they would have social clubs, related to industry. And when you lose your industry and you lose your sense of community, you have despair, and that's what he feeds on. So I think he only tells you half the story, but he's got quite a convincing narrative about multiculturalism and immigration.
Well, it's convincing certainly to a growing number of people in this country. And he obviously represents himself, as does Farage from the Reform Party, as sort of being these patriots who truly understand the nature of British identity. And of course, in the last few weeks, we have seen a visible display of what some people call patriotism, what others call a dog whistle to the far right. That, of course, I'm referring to is the rise of the flags across the capital and across the country. In fact, my uncle called me from Essex and he was like, they sprouted out everywhere. And he's like, I'm not really sure what to make of them. And I think that's true for a lot of us because now Americans, we know you guys are super patriotic and you tend to fly your flag high outside your homes. British people don't really do that. It's not really been a big tradition of people waving the British flag, apart from maybe football matches or the Olympics. Or so this is a fairly new thing. And what I'm curious to hear from you is, a lot of people looking at it from the outside will go, what's the issue with people flying the British flag? This is Britain. Why can't people just fly the British flag?
If you speak to Black and Asian elders, they will tell you that when they saw the Union Jack, they would see a member of the National Front with the Union Jack targeting them. They knew it was trouble. That's the reality. We can't ignore history. That's what was happening in the 70s and 80s, where there were certain parts of Luton that you couldn't walk through as a Pakistani because you'd get your head kicked in by racist thugs. A national flag doesn't have to be a symbol of hate. It doesn't have to be a symbol of exclusion, but they created that symbol of exclusion. Now, for me, when I'm in Pakistan, I will see the Pakistani flag everywhere. So I'm not offended by the Union Jack. Maybe my reality is different because I've grown up in a town where I've never felt unsafe, really. But look at this campaign, Raise the Colours. Who set up the campaign is one of Tommy Robinson's former right-hand men. And tied to this campaign, we have seen attacks on mosques. We've seen the Red Cross on the walls of mosques in Basildon and other parts of the country. We've seen racist graffiti in the northeast of England. We've seen an increase. I can't quantify this. I don't think there's any statistics out there, but just the amount of reports I've had of Muslim women being targeted in the street. It's not coincidental that this is happening while people are talking about national pride and we're proud to be British and Englishness. And so there's no offence when it comes to waving a Union Jack or an England flag, but when it's tied to an increase in racist violence, then of course we're going to be concerned. Unfortunately, the far right have allowed people in minority communities to feel a sense of fear, to feel unsafe, to have refugees feeling like they can't walk into the streets anymore because there's a protest every other day. Is that about pride? Is that about patriotism? Is that about making Britain a better place to live?
What would you say to, I guess, Prime Minister Keir Starmer's comments recently saying, we can't basically relinquish that flag to the far right? And we've had similar debates, I think, in other European countries. I remember when I was in France recently, this also came up. It was like, who puts up the French flag? And weirdly, it seems to always be the far right people.
Yeah.
But we still, the rest of us, have pride in our flag because it's our country and we're proud of many aspects of it. But for some reason, we wouldn't necessarily fly that flag in that way. So what really is the meaning of that kind of flying a flag? For me, I'll tell you what I think. I interpret it when I see it as a dog whistle to say, this right here is far right territory and just know where you are. And I particularly feel that with the St. George's flag. The Union Jack, for whatever reason, I don't feel the same way. But if I see a St. George's flag, I feel like you're telling me covertly who you are.
Look, when an England game is on, I will see English flags. And I know people of colour that will fly the flag and wear the kit and support the team. But I have to be honest, and as a Muslim, if I'm walking into an area and I'm seeing England flags everywhere, I'm feeling that sense of dread, unfortunately, because that's my reality. I get death threats as a Muslim journalist. I get targeted by the far right, and I have to be careful where I walk all of my sisters who wear the hijab and my mum have faced racist violence. I'm looking out for their safety. Patriotism doesn't have to be a bad thing. For me, patriotism is about caring about your community and by extension caring about your country. My patriotism is helping my elderly neighbor with her shopping. It's about making sure my street is nice and clean. It's about ensuring that public services work for the British people and our public utility companies are run in the interests of our people. That's my patriotism. We're being lectured on patriotism by people who can't even pay British taxes to fund British public services. Even at Tommy Robinson's rally, why are they belting out the US anthem? Why have you got Israeli flags there? Why are you saying you're going to go fight in Israel? Is that British patriotism?
So I definitely want to return to a number of those points throughout this conversation. I want to ask you before that about kind of the reaction that we've seen from our politicians. So, the Prime Minister was referring to kind of this exacerbating toxic divisions. And there has been some condemnation, I'd say, kind of across the board of these marches, basically not being what we do here sort of thing, The protesters themselves claim that they were marching for a number of different things. And one of them is they claim that they are marching for free speech. And I want to ask you about this claim because we saw, very recently, Lucy Connolly, who was brought up onto the stage at the Reform Party conference. Lucy Connolly, for those who don't know, was one of the people who tweeted in support of incitement to violence during the Stockport attack, which then did lead to actual violence against people. And she was convicted and recently released from prison. Now, what I found really interesting was that outside prison, her team and her were holding up banners saying things like, "Police our streets, not our tweets." And I found that really interesting because I feel like a very similar sentiment is being expressed on the left, actually, particularly when it comes to expressing, for example, views on Palestine. Palestine action, police our streets, not our tweets or our banners. Do you ever feel like, of those 110 to 150,000 people that were on this march, there might be people who are there for some valid reasons?
So just a few points. So firstly, Lucy Connolly was inciting violence at a time where people were quite literally trying to burn down hotels in Tamworth and Rotherham, right? Incitement to violence is not free speech. There is a limit. I believe that we should speak to people we disagree with. I believe people shouldn't be imprisoned for saying things that I find offensive. But where we have to draw the line is incitement to violence. Because I tell you what, if it was a Muslim who had said something like kill the politicians, all of these guys, Farage, Tice, Tommy Robinson, they would be leading a big campaign to get that person not just arrested, but probably deported, if we're being honest. So this nonsense about two-tier policing is gaslighting. When it's ethnic minorities who are disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system, they talk about policing on their protests. If you go to a protest, a far-right protest and a counter-protest, the police are frequently allowing these alt-right agitators with their cameras, they call themselves auditors, into the anti-racist demonstration, and they're not doing anything about it. And so when it comes to two-tier policing, you've got old grannies holding up posters saying, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine action. They're getting nicked, while you've got racists committing acts of violence and they're not being arrested. They're not being arrested. I had a guy fly kick me in Liverpool a few weeks ago. He didn't get arrested. They let him off. So where's the two-tier policing? There is two-tier policing, but it's those guys who are being treated leniently. In terms of whether some of those protesters had legitimate concerns around free speech, I don't necessarily think it's their free speech under threat, though I do think we can't characterize all of them as hardcore fascists and racists. And I think sometimes I get frustrated where good people, well-meaning people on the anti-racist side will say things like Nazi scum off our street, fascist scum off our street. Tommy Robinson's not a Nazi. He's an Islamophobe. He hates Muslims. He doesn't hate Jews. He doesn't necessarily hate Hindus and Sikhs. In fact, he's been trying to work with those communities to oppose Muslims. So I think we have to be a bit smarter in our anti-racism as well. We need to differentiate between a hardcore fascist who will always hate my guts as a Muslim, who perhaps sometimes needs to be physically opposed on the street, and someone who's perhaps you come from a white working class community and you've watched this BBC drama Three Girls, which is about grooming gangs, and you read these horrific stories of working class girls being exploited and treated horrendously, and you see the way the authorities fail them, you see the way the police forces fail them, and that's your introduction to Mr. Tommy Robinson, and he's talking about grooming gangs, the rape of young women. Now, I find all of that appalling. It sickens me, and I've written at length about grooming gangs, and I've said we should all be doing more about it. But if you've never interacted with a Muslim or a Pakistani, and that's your introduction, it's very easy to see how an individual could be influenced by Tommy Robinson without knowing about his past. And it's the same thing when it comes to these protests outside the hotels housing refugees. There is a genuine belief amongst a large number of people that they are a threat to women and children. And unfortunately, we've got a whole ecosystem of alt-right YouTubers. We've got GB News, we've got Talk TV. We've always had the print media pushing out these narratives. It's so easy to understand how people can be brainwashed by these narratives and why they might feel the need to protest on the street. Because the other thing that people like Tommy Robinson do, and Elon Musk as well, is it's not just about the migrants or the Muslims. It's about there's a government conspiracy to silence you.
A government conspiracy to silence you, but also I think what we hear a lot from this cohort is that there is a political correctness, a woke mindset that is impeding the police and government from appropriately dealing with certain types of crime. And so the grooming gangs is always raised in this context, right? We always hear it's like, well, the government didn't want to reveal the extent to which this was, an overwhelmingly, Pakistani cohort of men that they claim was specifically targeting white girls. And I remember years ago when this, because obviously for those of us who are just joining us on this discussion may think this is a new thing, this particular issue has been going on almost a decade.
Yeah, over 20 years.
Over 20 years.
Yeah.
Over 20 years they've been recycling this story, partly because the victims of these grooming gangs have not seen justice. And again we hear these young women who are now oftentimes adults saying, the guys who did this to me are still out there. And I can completely understand, and I know that you do as well, why that would cause those communities to feel absolutely devastated that not enough was done to support those young women.
Yeah.
The question is, why do we keep bringing it back to race? Because the reports on this issue are manifold in outlining the concerns and the failings that occurred when it came to these vulnerable girls. And chief amongst them was, let's be honest, that the welfare services, the social services, who were in many cases responsible for these young girls, were not doing their due diligence. They were not ensuring these girls were coming back. When these girls were complaining about certain issues, they were not being taken seriously. And the support clearly wasn't there for them.
If we look at what was happening in these care homes, these white working class girls were treated like trash by everyone, by the local authorities, by social services, by the police. They were blamed for the crimes committed against them. And they were labelled child prostitutes. You had campaigners in the early 2000s raising these concerns and saying, you need to deal with this, South Yorkshire Police, you need to tackle this issue, and they refused to. And so it was complete neglect of working class girls. I think those of us on the left could have been more vocal on it, because this is an issue about women's rights. This is an issue of exploitation. And by refusing to even talk about the issue, we've allowed people like Tommy Robinson to take what is a very serious scandal and make it about race. If we look at the evidence, in group-based sexual offending, in some police force areas, Asians were overrepresented. Now, Asians are also overrepresented in the nighttime economy, working as taxi drivers and takeaway workers. And so that form of sexual abuse, yes, there were Asians overrepresented. If we look at sexual abuse and sexual exploitation more generally, we know there's been scandals in all, everywhere you look, in the media.
Epstein, Clinton, hello.
In the church. And if you're serious about tackling sexual violence and sexual exploitation, you should be consistent in calling it out wherever you see it. And that's my concern. So I actually do support the national inquiry into grooming gangs, because for me, it's not about race. It's not about the far right. It's not about Tommy Robinson. It's about making sure that those working class girls get the justice they deserve, that we root out this problem. And look, the mosques in 2013, 500 mosques came together and they did a sermon against grooming gangs. 2016 in Luton, there was a group, Faiths Against Sexual Exploitation, run by Christians and Muslims. So there are people within the Muslim community that have called this out. I don't know anyone in my town who's ever felt that this is an issue we should shy away from. They're disgusted by it. We know what Islam says about these issues. But people like Tommy Robinson and others, they've tried to link this to Islam. They've tried to link this to Pakistanis. And the other thing to say here, it's not just white working class girls that were exploited. There were Muslim girls who were exploited. There were Sikh girls who were exploited. And there's a cultural stigma that's prevented a lot of those victims coming forward. And there's great groups out there like Apna Haq, and they're supporting women. There's others within the Gurdwaras and the mosques. They've been trying to do more work around this. So it's not about race, it's about the exploitation of young women and girls. And what frustrates me about this is last year we had these racist riots, people saying it's all about women and girls, our women are being targeted. 2 in 5 of the people arrested for rioting had previously been reported for domestic violence. 2 in 5. That's a huge number. So are you really out there to protect women and girls? No, you're not. In fact, you're targeting Muslim women and girls. You're spitting on Muslim women who wear the head hijab. You're targeting them on the street. They're getting abuse on public transport. I mean, that horrific sexual assault in Oldbury. So what is it about? Is it about sexual violence or is it about racism? And it's very obviously and clearly about racism. You made the point earlier around policing. The police have failed to deal with racism in this country. I had Muslim women in Wales just after the riot saying we were spat on in the street and we reported it to the police and they said it's just low-level antisocial behavior. So even this idea of like the police are politically correct or the police are failing, no, they're not. The police have been horrific on racism. When you study the history of policing in Britain, you'll understand that they consistently fail to tackle racism. And even now, despite the narrative around political correctness and wokeness, the reality on the ground is very, very different. And I've seen so many examples of Muslims being failed by the criminal justice system.
And so I also noted the timing of, what appears to be the political assassination of Charlie Kirk in America, who was, of course, a far-right YouTuber who was shot on a university campus. There was a minute of silence held for Charlie Kirk during this rally. How many people do you think actually even knew who Charlie Kirk was before that rally?
It's interesting. I feel like the British far right have had this process of Yankification, you might call it, where there's so much American influence, even this stuff around Christ is King. I mean, who used to say Christ is King in Britain? No one said it, and now you're getting it graffitied on a mosque wall, Christ is King. I do think, though, that the alt-right have very successfully built up these huge platforms on YouTube, and they're reaching millions of people. And so for a lot of the people holding that minute silence, they're making martyrs of these individuals.
These individuals who were shot by someone from a family that was Trump supporting, Republican card holding.
But they don't care about the facts. For them, it's, oh, this is Antifa. This is, Tommy, be careful, Tommy. You might get assassinated. He is also their martyr. When he went to prison, they were acting like he's a political prisoner. No, he broke the law and he went to prison. But facts don't matter to these people. They want to construct a narrative. It's really interesting when there was this whole thing around Manchester Airport where there was the Asian family and the police had targeted them. And, straight away, all the far right said, oh, well, the Pakistani family attacked the police. It was all over their social media. And I was just thinking, I've been following all of these anti-migrant protests. You guys always attack the police. You always throw bottles. You always throw glass. But when it's Pakistanis that have an issue with the police, you're backing the police. You love law and order. So they're very, very selective in what they say. This whole thing about violence. How many people were inciting violence at that Tommy Robinson rally? What are the kind of... Tommy Robinson has previously said, pointed at Housen and said, there's enemy combatants in these houses. When people were smashing up houses during the riots last year in Hartlepool, they were screaming, "Oh, Tommy, Tommy." So do these people really condemn violence? It's interesting in Oldbury, after that sexual assault and racist attack on a Sikh, Tommy's really trying his best to cultivate the support of other minorities. He came out and said, "What are you attacking Indians for?" And to me, that said, Pakistanis are fair play, Muslims are fair play, but don't attack the Sikhs and Hindus. So they're always selective when it comes to violence.
So that's very interesting, because I think the nature of the type of vitriol that we are hearing on these marches is very clearly directed at Muslims. And migrants and asylum seekers has become a byword for the word Muslim. Muslim is now used as a slur, as a dirty word. It's, all of this is one catch-all phrase for problem people. And that's very interesting to me in relation to where we find ourselves right now. Because to what extent would you say that the scale and intensity of this rally was just an organic manifestation of British public frustration, or certainly a portion of it, versus maybe a deliberate political manipulation? And you touched on this idea of like these Christian symbols at the rally, which 12% of British people attend church once a month, not once a week, once a month. So I'm sorry, Christianity, what? The churches keep complaining that they can't fill their pews, and yet you're at this rally centering Christianity. And I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but to me, it wasn't centering Christianity. It was centering a crusader narrative that was weaponizing Christianity as part of a vision of a clash of civilizations, which we know they've been pushing forever. This notion of like a Judeo-Christian civilization, which is also wild, because question for any audience member who would like to do a little bit of research, you tell me what it is that Jews and Christians share that we Muslims don't also share with them. Answers on a box. Rally, organic, frustrations, or political manipulation?
I think it's really funny, the whole Christianity thing, because some of the best allies in the anti-racist struggle have been devout Christians. It was really funny. I was watching, there was a post that someone put up of the Muslim hikers, and he was saying how, the women at the church had opened their doors for the Muslim hikers and given them cakes. That's real Christianity. That's the Christianity you see in multicultural communities. Lovely people that get on with us. And historically, they were allies in the fight against the National Front in the 70s and 80s.
You mean just like Jesus stood with the poor and the meek and the prostitutes and those isolated from society? You don't say. Sorry.
They're lovely people, and they're trying to make this about a clash of civilizations, as you said. Who are the people keeping the churches alive in England? They're immigrants, Africans, Indians. They're the people regularly that you see at the church. So was this organic? Was there a bit of, firstly, this guy is very well funded. That's another point to make. Like, you look at who gives him money. Robert Shillman, tech billionaire, gave him a fellowship to work at Rebel News in 2017, also funded 20 other fellowships. They've got lots of money. They've got lots of donations coming in. They get their legal fees covered. You've got Elon Musk, because it's a counter narrative, firstly, to what we've seen on the streets since the genocide in Gaza. You look at the iPaper's investigation into Yaxi Lenin. He wanted to oppose the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, which were reaching hundreds of thousands on the street. And he wanted to unite Sikhs and Hindus and other groups to do it. So he always had an agenda to counter these big demonstrations in central London, say they're our streets, the pro-Palestinian lot, because it's all about flags for them, isn't it? Oh, look, there's Palestinian flags in the capital. But he's also got connections to Zionists. He's got Zionist funding. These are no conspiracy theories. Robert Shillman was on the board of Friends of the Israeli Defense Forces. The Middle East Forum, I think £47,000 spent on his legal fees. He said he would fight for Israel. So there's a connection there between the contemporary far right and the Zionists, and it makes complete sense. If you want to oppose the Palestinians, Islamophobia is one of the best weapons to do that. And so this was about them trying to reclaim the streets. They were frustrated to see hundreds of thousands of people of all backgrounds marching on the streets opposing genocide. And if we think about the lead up to those riots last year, when we were out on the streets demonstrating to end the genocide in Gaza, you had the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman saying there's hate marchers on the streets. Then you have the now Reform MP Lee Anderson saying Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, is controlled by Islamists. Then you have Nigel Farage goes on telly and says certain British Muslims don't share British values. So there's always been a connection between those two things, Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian sentiment. And so that was the lead up. You had papers talking about, the Islamists are taking over the streets. You had, I think, when Mr. Galloway won in Rochdale, you had Rishi Sunak come out on the steps of Downing Street. That's very rare for a prime minister to come. We've got forces tearing apart the country. This whole thing about sectarian voting, even Labour politicians fed into this narrative, partly because they were afraid of losing their seats, that there's this intimidation and abuse from Muslims. And they were playing into this narrative of those evil Muslims who they've got so much power in Britain now that they can influence election outcomes. And we need to counter those guys. So there was always that agenda here. So there's been a lot of money and also social media manipulation. You look at Tommy Robinson getting his account reinstated on X. You look at
by Mr. Musk himself.
Yeah, exactly. I think he's got himself 200 million followers. He's amplified so many right-wing accounts. There was one account called Inevitable West, and there's a rumor that it's run by an Indian guy, not actually from Britain. But I remember seeing that page going from a few thousand to maybe hundreds of thousands of followers, and frequently getting millions of views on their posts. A lot of it misinformation.
Yeah.
These guys are a threat to democracy. Mr. Musk, he's talking about the US elections, the German elections. And the other agenda here is, why do they want to push anti-migrant, anti-Muslim sentiment? Because they want us to stop talking about other things. Elon Musk, at that speech, why is he talking about deregulation? What's deregulation got to do with Muslims and migrants? Why is he using that platform to talk about that? Why has he previously talked about, taxation being tyranny and things like that? If he's so concerned about Mexicans crossing the border, what's that got to do with taxation? So it's about taking legitimate anger and frustration from working class people, because when you think about where Reform are doing particularly well, or where Trump did particularly well, northeast of England, former mining communities lost their industry, lost the community built around industry, have nothing. They have nothing. They're living miserable lives. They are poor people. They're not privileged in any sense of the imagination. Now, if you're really, really angry, you need an outlet to vent that frustration and anger. And logically, you would say, well, the super rich have failed to invest in my town. They're taking money out of the economy. We need to tax the rich and invest in public services. These are very popular economic views. These are very, very popular. But instead, all of that energy and frustration and anger is directed towards Muslims and migrants. And I tell you what, if Reform get into government and they cut migration, some people think Reform get into government and they'll fall on their own sword. They'll be so bad at governing that we'll go back to Labour or Tory or whatever. No, they will find the new target, and it will be Muslims and multiculturalism. That's what's happening across Europe. It's no longer just about migration. It's about established minority communities. So things will get worse.
On the subject of why this discourse is being pushed, you mentioned the Palestine protests. I do note that, just after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, Netanyahu was out in the news, very quickly, clearly not busy enough with annihilating Gaza, talking about the idea that there is this dangerous alliance between progressives and Islamists, Muslims, and I hear echoes of that in this particular protest. I just want to reference a few of the people that were there, right? So we had far-right French politician, former disgraced presidential candidate Éric Zemmour, who's a big proponent of the Great Replacement theory, which is itself a far-right conspiracy theory that builds on the idea that somehow Muslims are out to outpopulate the quote-unquote native population of Europe. And this is very popular amongst the far right, but it's also seeped into increasingly mainstream discourse. I guess what I want to ask you is, how have we got to a point today where something like the Great Replacement theory, which is so clearly a far right, Looney Tune conspiracy. What are we conspiring out here as Muslims? Like, yeah, have more babies so that we can outnumber them. Like, what? Are we for real out here? How is that now normalized? How is that, something that people are now integrating as a sort of, casual conversation point?
It's really interesting, the whole thing about empire. Britain colonized a quarter of the world, and they directly recruited from the colonies after the Second World War. They literally went to Barbados and said, we need West Indians to work on London transport. They were desperate for workers. And black and Asian immigrants worked in the worst industries, the factories, mills and foundries. They were denied housing. They were treated horribly. So their labor was always required, but their presence was always despised. And that was true before the Second World War as well. You've had South Asians and black people in Britain for over 400 years. After the First World War, in the port cities, you had riots. Now, there was economic downturn, but it was also this anxiety around white women being in a relationship with a black man. That's historically always been a thing.
White innocence.
Yeah, 1958, Notting Hill, same thing. Even within the hostels that housed West Indians just after 48, you had many what you might call disturbances over relationships between black and white women. So there's always been this kind of anxiety around preserving the white race. And even colonialism itself, it was tied to this narrative of, we're civilizing the savages. We need to go in there and give them Christianity and civilize them, when actually what you're doing is looting our country. I mean, the word loot comes from India. So they took resources, they deindustrialized places like India, they benefited directly from the transatlantic slave trade to build port cities like Liverpool. But the population, the working class population, they're not being taught about the horrors of empire. They're being taught, you might be poor in Britain, but at least you're better than those black and brown people. At least you're not them. You've got a flag to cling on to. You've got an Englishness to cling on to. And that's what it's always been about. This thing around declining birth rates, yeah, it's true. Europeans are having less children. And the reality is, in the West, the cost of living is a huge factor in that. People can't settle. People are getting married a bit later on, and they're struggling. We've got the 2-child limit on benefits. It's the single biggest driver of child poverty in the country. It's quite ironic that Nigel Farage opposes it. Tories don't oppose it, he does. And I believe that's tied to his idea of the Great Replacement theory. It's really funny because his supporters are like, oh, that's going to benefit the Pakistani kids. Why are you supporting that, Nigel? That's not for us white people. We don't have that many kids.
Yeah.
But an elderly population, declining birth rates, has consequences for the economy.
Yeah.
And it's why we have more migrants coming to Britain.
I want to ask you, though, about this idea that the march also featured people like the AfD in Germany who were live blogging from the event. These people are, overt racist. There's no kind of confusion over where they stand on these particular issues. But there were black and brown people on these marches. We had, the now broadcaster, former politician, former head of the Race and Equality Commission, Trevor Phillips, attending the march, telling us pretty much basically, this is going to sound a bit like Trump when he was referring to the people who came out on January the 6th, but, there were some very good people amongst them.
Yeah, I mean, this is what frustrates me. Tommy Robinson will be condemned by the political establishment. Trevor Phillips, a black man on telly who runs a Sky News show, he won't. But what's Trevor Phillips' background? What did Trevor Phillips say about Muslims? He previously wrote a story for The Sun, of all newspapers, saying that a Muslim family adopting a non-Muslim child is akin to child abuse. He was laughing it off at the Policy Exchange, a right-wing Islamophobic think tank, when he was called an Islamophobe. He was suspended by the Labour Party for Islamophobia. But he's not been cancelled. He's on daily television providing legitimacy to racist narratives. And nobody challenges him. And it's not just him. You've got so many people, you know, you can just speak with a posh accent and wear a suit, and you're no different from Tommy Robinson, but you say it in a sanitized way. Oh, they've got legitimate concerns. They've, you know, it's so frustrating for me because we have legitimate concerns as well. We grew up in poverty as well. We've lost our industry as well. We're still grafting. We're not trying to demonize anyone else. We're not attacking mosques and desecrating graves. So who counts as what we consider the left behind and the working class? Because ethnic minority people are disproportionately working class. Migrant workers are exploited so badly in this country. And it's so sad that the anti-migrant sentiment in Britain is so bad that we won't even hear the stories of exploitation of migrant workers in Britain. If you think a guy that puts his belongings in a bag and comes to your country on a boat is living some life of luxury, you're deluded. It's that simple. Yeah, we've got these people being put in these hotels, and we've got this narrative around 5-star hotels. And what's interesting is when you study the history, when Asian migrants were expelled from Uganda and East Africa, it was the same headlines. Asian invasion. They're put in 4-star hotels. You had National Front members picketing Heathrow Airport. It was the same rhetoric. And so there's a history to this. It's not come out of nowhere.
So I think it's interesting because I sense that because people are so squeezed economically in this country, and, you know, we have to remember things like 70% of people who live with poverty in this country are in working households.
Yeah.
That's working people who are struggling to feed their kids. And those people may well be observing that around them, you know, there is a hotel where there are people who have received a stipend from the government to provide for them because they've arrived and they need to be processed and they are being given accommodation. And they're saying, we don't get free accommodation. We don't get a stipend from the government.
Yeah.
And it reminded me a bit of the response to the recent TfL strikes, the Transport for London strikes in London, where so TfL went on strike over recently over working hours and working conditions. They want to go from a 35-hour week, which relative to the rest of Britain is already a very good deal relative to how much other people work, to a 32-hour week. They wanted improved mental health services, etc. A lot of people were angry with them. They were like, you know, this is outrageous. They already have a great package, etc. Rather than saying, hold on, wait, what? These guys have unionized, organized, and established actually some of the best working conditions of any of our industries through that leverage. And instead of us looking at it and thinking, that might be something we could learn about, we were just angry at them for having something that we didn't. And I feel like maybe there's some of that happening with these asylum seekers. Instead of saying, well, of course, we're not going to leave people who come here out on the streets with nothing, and we should provide for them, but we should also be making sure that working families in this country can afford to live and feed their kids and house themselves. We're just like, why have they got it and we don't? And I it's interesting because it didn't have to go that way, right? The analysis of what was happening to these asylum seekers didn't have to go in the direction of like, then take it away from them to give it to us. It could have been, well, that's a very basic standard of care that should apply to everyone. And why is it not applying to us? And it's not because we're spending, you know, 2 billion of the budget on asylum housing, because relative to our budget, that also isn't a huge amount.
I think it's the biggest barrier to building a mass movement is that race to the bottom mentality. You care about those people over there, but you don't care about us. And the reality is, when you look at the railway workers, as you said, they've got leverage power, they've got a strong union, and they're benefiting. And there's a lot to learn from them. When I was covering the wildcat strikes at Amazon factories a few years ago, the RMT was on strike summer 2022. And I was in these Telegram chats where they were coordinating the midnight walkouts. And they were saying, look at this guy, Mick Lynch. He's telling them how it is. He's standing up. We can stand up for ourselves as well. They were influenced by them, and they started going on wildcat strikes. And they had their first official strike in Coventry in January 2023. The RMT and other unions gave them solidarity. There was that big moment in the summer of 2022, which could have been a moment where we have riots and anti-migrant sentiment, but instead it was about the cost of living. The biggest concern amongst the public wasn't immigration, it was the economy. Energy bills were going through the roof. The price of everything was going up. You had Mick Lynch on the telly destroying journalists, telling them how it is, speaking in ordinary people's language. You had the posties going on strike, railway workers, nurses, teachers. There was this sense that we're all being shafted and we all need to stand up for ourselves. And even if you weren't on strike, you thought, we were clapping for these nurses a few years ago.
Weren't we?
And why are they not being paid a decent wage? Why are they having to use a food bank? And there was this collective sense that, no, we're being mugged off. The energy companies are mugging us off. The landlords are mugging us off. These big companies like Tesco are making money and charging us. And there was that sense of like, we all got to get together and do something. And there's a lot of people in Britain that are self-employed that can't necessarily join a union. But the campaigns around reducing energy bills and investing in housing, that was something we could all relate to. And that to me seems like the solution to tackling that kind of race to the bottom mentality, to say we can all get together and demand things are made better for us. But it does require solidarity. It does require nurses standing with railway workers and railway workers standing with teachers, and all of us. Like, I remember when I was an industrial correspondent, so I was covering a lot of strikes and unions.
Yeah.
And I was in the barber shop, and the guy was like, well, where's my pay rise? I'm self-employed. I said to him, what about your energy bills? You know, the cost of you running your shop is ridiculous, right? So why don't you get involved in a campaign to reduce energy bills? We'll all benefit from something like that.
Right. Here at The Tea, we are all about cutting through the noise and giving you real, balanced conversations. And that's why we love using Ground News. Ground News shows you how different news outlets cover the same story, and their blind spot feed reveals stories that one side of the political spectrum just isn't talking about. For instance, this week in the US, Latino leaders condemned the recent ICE operations in Chicago that included a fatal shooting, stating that these incidents are alarming to the community. Ground News helps you understand how stories are framed, who's ignoring what, and why that matters. It's become an essential part of how we research for The Tea. It's shocking sometimes to see what we're not seeing. We use Ground News to make sure we're bringing you the full picture. And as a loyal tea drinker, you can subscribe to Ground News today and get unlimited access at 40% of their Vantage plan to see the world beyond your feed and stay informed without the spin. Check it out at ground.news/the tea. We thank Ground News for sharing our dedication to showing the whole story and for supporting our community and our independence. Let's talk a little bit now about the story behind the story here. So who exactly is bankrolling all of this and why? So Tommy Robinson was actually bankrupt and jailed. He literally came out of jail in August this year. Then he pulls off a huge rally by any standards. There's no yet public record of who funded it, but we do know that he's previously been linked to some pretty shady people who you referenced earlier on, including like US think tanks like the Middle East Forum, which have previously covered Robinson's legal fees, a kind of pro-Israel think tank. So then we obviously saw Musk, who has also been very pro-Israel and pro-disinformation. Why did an American Zionist think tank fund Robinson's career, get him out of jail? And what do people like them get from keeping him afloat? Why is Tommy Robinson being bankrolled by these shady people, and who are they?
Well, firstly, I think Tommy Robinson is their poster boy because he has the backstory, because he's got that working class background, because there are elements of truth in some of the things he said, in the sense that we did have Al Muhajirun in Luton. They did protest the homecoming. They did spit at the soldiers. He's got a story to tell. He's exaggerated that story. He's added his own thing into it. But if you don't understand Luton and you don't understand him, it's very easy to believe it. A billionaire can't do that. People will say, well, what on earth have you got to say about Britain? You're in America and you're living off millions of pounds. Whereas he can say, I had to look down when I was in college because of the Muslim lads. It was really difficult to be white in Luton. So you've got a sob story. You've got he is an effective communicator. He is quite likable amongst them. So they are going to bankroll him. Why do they want to bankroll him? Because it allows them to say what they can't say. It allows them to say Israel is a democracy. Israel is fighting these evil Muslims in Palestine, and they're right here in Britain as well. Because what we've seen, particularly during this genocide, is public opinion is moving against Israel. It's swinging behind the Palestinian people. It's across Europe this is happening, despite all the propaganda, despite, you know, all of our political class and our media class getting behind Israel. I think social media has played a role in a lot of that as well. People are saying, well, we can see the footage, what's coming out of Gaza. If you're an editor in a newsroom, or you're a picture editor, how can you not be pro-Palestine by just seeing what's coming out? So they're losing the battle for public opinion, and they have a more effective narrative now to say, oh yeah, you know, Israel's doing horrible things, but it's because those Muslims are really, really evil people. And you have to look back to post 9/11. What the narrative was. How did they pass all of these measures around surveillance? How did they justify the Iraq war? How did they justify Afghanistan? How do they justify all of these attacks on our civil liberties? You need a bogeyman. You need someone to hate upon. I think from the American billionaire perspective, they also say to the Americans, here's what could happen to you guys. You see how these Muslims are in Britain? That's what they're going to be like in America. They're going to take over your streets. There's going to be no-go zones. I think even Trump had retweeted, was it Britain first, when they said like Birmingham's a no-go zone or something like that. So Britain for them is almost like, well, here's the blueprint of what's going to happen in America. So it's interesting that so many of these Americans are always concerned with Britain, and the way Elon Musk depicts Britain as like it's like North Korea, it's tyranny, and you can't speak your mind.
But that's interesting, isn't it? Because he is using these protests also, as you said, to push this idea about deregulation, because, and this is surely some of the tea on this, that he's very unhappy about the UK Online Safety Act,
Yeah.
which would curb some of the far right BS, misinformation, disinformation that these people are engaged in. And so it's very concerning to me that when I'm seeing many legacy outlets discuss these protests, it's such a superficial level of like, oh, there's just a lot of angry people on the right who are not being listened to, and they have very valid concerns. And I think you and I have discussed that, you know, I'm prepared to hear some of the concerns as valid. And I think it's really important that, you know, the left and right divide is seemingly falling apart on many issues. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what we're talking about. But the idea that Elon Musk cares one iota about the UK and anything other than just preserving his media monopoly is absolutely insane. That anyone believes that Elon Musk is attending this or in any way supporting it because he has an ideological affinity for anything other than his own pocket surely is wild.
Yeah, and the thing about someone like Elon Musk, he's not very talented. If you hear him speak, he's a rubbish public speaker. If you've got so much money, what do you want next? You want power. And that's what often happens with these billionaires. Yes, they can change legislation and influence democracies, but it's also about status and power. That's a big driving factor. Matthew Goodwin, he started off as an academic studying the far right. Now he's got a Substack, he's got a YouTube channel, he's got a GB News show. That's good money. He's making good money. I wouldn't be surprised if he's a millionaire. And you've got this whole kind of ecosystem of anti-Muslim content, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, I imagine, by this point, because you've got people's anxieties and fears, and you're saying, subscribe to my Substack. I'm going to tell you all about the evil Sharia enclave of Bradford or Birmingham, and you will have people who are deeply worried about Britain subscribing. So we're not just the target anymore. We are their content. They don't want this to stop. They don't want to fix Britain. They don't want solutions, because the moment you fix Britain and bring communities together, you lose all of that content. So there's a lot of that going on at the moment, and it's a very crowded field as well. Everyone's competing for attention on who's the most anti-Muslim, who's the most anti-migrant. Even Farage is being criticized for not being anti-Muslim enough.
And it's interesting because Rachel Shabi, who was on our show previously, who is a British Israeli writer, and she's author of a book that touches on some of these issues, and she discusses very well documented networks of the far right across Europe that are funded and welcomed by Israel, because Israel likes to propagate and disseminate an idea of Muslims being the ultimate threat, because it feeds into their self representation as being the front line of this existential civilizational war of, the West against the Muslims. And of course, here Muslims is a stand-in for Palestinians, even though not all Palestinians are Muslims. And the West Israel is somehow a stand-in for the West, even though the West is absolutely not aligned in terms of our values, our purported values, with an apartheid state engaged, as the latest UN report says, genocide. So it's a completely constructed mythology, but that is, as you say, very well funded and increasingly effective. And, I do want people to hear clearly that it is a scary time for Muslims, because there is so much directed towards our communities as problem communities that, people are being attacked, like you said, in the street. Mosques are being attacked. Graveyards are being desecrated. These are not just intellectual debates. They have very real world consequences on people's lives.
It's frightening. I remember the New Zealand attack and praying Jummah like a few days later. And you have that feeling like it could happen anytime. It's not even about riots. It could be one individual who is radicalized by these. And there's so many plots being uncovered of like neo-Nazis with weapons in Britain, plotting to target mosques in Britain. These people are playing with fire from the very top of, the Conservative Party, our media class. I'm not just talking about GB News, mainstream media playing with fire in these narratives with very little care for the victims of these attacks. Last year, I barely got a wink of sleep during those riots. I was getting so many reports as one of the few Muslim journalists in the media from worried families saying, we've had racist abuse here. We're hearing that the far right are coming here. Everyone was terrified, and I think it was a different experience depending on who you were. Not even just in terms of Muslim and non-Muslim, even within the Muslim community.
Of course.
If you live in Luton, you feel quite safe. If you're a Muslim in Hartlepool or Hull or Sunderland or Great Yarmouth, you feel absolutely terrified. And there were stories that I was getting of Muslim women having panic attacks, people barricading themselves in their homes. And people think I'm being dramatic, but just look at the scenes in the northeast of England. Look at what was happening. Look at what they were doing. They were smashing up any house they could see and chanting Tommy Robinson, targeting mosques. After those riots, look how quickly our political and media class moved on. They wouldn't even say the word Islamophobia. Even in this kind of increase in racist attacks over the summer, where was the statement from Mr. Starmer? There was nothing.
Where is the commission on Islamophobia? Where is the agreed upon government definition on Islamophobia? We can't even agree on the terminology.
Well, there's a whole campaign to say they're trying to silence your free speech by defining Islamophobia. You've got Tory MPs, you just Google this and there'll be so many newspaper articles on, if we talk about Islamophobia, that's a threat to free speech.
Can we take a second right here? Because surely we cannot have this conversation without talking about how the word anti-Semitism is used to actually silence free speech when it comes to criticism of Israel. That there is an actual definition of anti-Semitism that is propagated that literally conflates criticism of the state of Israel that is involved in genocide with anti-Semitism, and you're trying to convince us that defining Islamophobia is
Yeah.
the problem. Is anyone paying attention?
It's so frustrating. I remember I was on a Politics Live panel and I was being told, you're trying to bring in blasphemy by the back door. And I said, I don't give a damn what your view is on Islam or theology. I don't want to, I'm not a scholar. I'm not here to debate you on Islam. I just want my mum and my sister to feel safe. I just want the government to start taking action, because why should, my sister was in Great Yarmouth. She's pushing a disabled woman up a ramp. She's contributing to this country, and she's being told F off, back to your country. And it's Muslim women, particularly those who wear the hijab, that are often targeted by these individuals. And it's often things like public transport, you're just minding your business, you're getting racist abuse. Why should we have to suffer that? And why should we have to accept this double standard where if you demonstrate in support of Palestine alongside Jewish people and you call out genocide, you're being labeled anti-Semite, whereas if you're being attacked on the streets of this country by racists and your mosques are being targeted, we have all this nonsense about legitimate concerns. It's just an absurd double standard from our political and media class.
And I guess it's particularly disappointing from the left, but I'm personally one of the people moving away from this notion of a clear left-right divide, because I think that there are actually a lot of things that even the people that I was seeing interviewed on this march were talking about. So, you know, I was reading that 70%, I think, of Reform voters support the idea of sick benefits immediately and an end to 0-hour contracts.
Yes.
I was like, that is a classic left-wing position.
Yeah.
I am unclear why you are at a Reform rally. They also support things like, you know, the idea that there's a frustration with the ruling class, with the government. Absolutely.
Yeah.
A lot of people share that. So I'm listening to a lot of this stuff and I'm thinking, this is being directed towards migrants by foreign government funding, actually. But really, some of what's being said here does need to be picked up on and isn't being capitalized upon by the same people who claim to care about working class communities. And of course, I'm thinking first and foremost about Labour, but beyond Labour, I want to ask you whether you feel that there is something in how the left in general has responded to these individuals. And I'm not talking about the leaders and the Musks and all that. I'm talking about the people that were on these marches. You know, I see how they're talked about on my feed. Oh, they're, you know, retarded football hooligans. They are, you know, twats, idiots. You know, you name it, insulting, uneducated twat. Like, a lot of it is denigrated mockery of working class people. And I can see how that only fuels the idea that, you know, the left is basically these liberal elites that are completely disconnected from the very communities they claim to care for. So is there anything in the response to these protests that you think is actually adding fuel to the fire?
Loads. I mean, I've been in many left-wing spaces. I've worked closely when I was editing Tribune with Labour members of Parliament, with trade union general secretaries. I'm very involved in the left. And what I have seen is a shift from a left that once had many working class people in it, who worked as shop stewards and union organisers in the shipbuilding industry, in the coal mines, who understood working class people, who are rooted in communities, who had that direct connection. And now, unfortunately, there's quite a lot of student and academic types, many of whom come from middle class, posh backgrounds, who will never live and breathe what working class people live and breathe. And they will project onto them what they think are their values. They will pontificate about the working class and the proletariat, and they've read Marx. They've never worked like a hard graft ever. And that's a completely different experience. And, you know, this thing about, you know, white working class, or Gary with this many GCSEs with broken teeth or whatever. I know many people with broken teeth who are white and working class who aren't racist thugs. And in Luton, some of the poorest people in our town are white working class people. Very few of them will go to sixth form college or whatever or get good jobs. They're not racist. They live with us. They live and breathe the same things we live and breathe. And I just think when you think about where Reform have done particularly well, they are former Labour strongholds. We're talking about Durham. Durham has the Durham Miners Gala. It had many, coal mining pits. That job wasn't necessarily easy, but it was a secure unionised job. And they were solid Labour voters. Many of them were left-wing. You think about Doncaster, again, reforms taken over that council. Former seaside towns, which once had a thriving tourism industry, Great Yarmouth, Clacton with Farages, Blackpool. These are very poor areas with high levels of people on incapacity benefit, partly as a result of deindustrialisation, because when you lost those jobs, they were never replaced by decent jobs. In many predominantly white working class communities, you don't just have deprivation, you also have a lack of social infrastructure. And what I mean by social infrastructure is your parks, your pubs, areas where people can gather. I find that in more multicultural, diverse communities, we have a stronger third sector, we have more charities, we have more mosques and gurdwaras, and they often fill the role of the state by providing things like food banks, supporting people. These people in poor parts of the country have nothing. And I'm never, ever going to excuse racism, regardless of how poor you are, because I know many Black and Asian people are broke. But I do think we have to, Desmond Tutu said, you have to sometimes go upstream and find out why people are falling in the well. Why are people being radicalized, and how can we stop it? And the far right feed on deprivation and despair. They are using working class people, and our job has to be on the left is to be present in these places, to build connections with people in these communities. And I do genuinely believe that there's a big proportion of those reform voters that can be won over. Too often people on the left dismiss them as unwinnable. They believe there's this alternative coalition to be constructed consisting of Muslims, minorities, young people, students. And even the way they talk about Muslims as if they're a monolith, and as if like the left will click their fingers because they spoke about Gaza and they'd all like rush down behind them. That's not the reality. We have social conservatism in the Muslim community as well. We have dodgy landlords, we have dodgy bosses. And so you cannot organize on the basis of identity alone. You have to build a coalition. You have to focus on the bread and butter issues. They are winning over working class people, industrial manual workers. The left has to be honest about this. Don't claim to represent the working class when a lot of your base is middle class people.
Absolutely. And I think that that shift is not being outed for what it is, because actually, if you don't represent the working class, say it with a straight face, and let's, discuss representation for working class communities in this country that is not hell bent on essentially directing them towards the interests that serve a foreign government, because I don't believe that the Reform Party and what they push, and certainly not what the EDL and their likes push, has anything to do with the best interests of anyone in Britain at all, actually. Certainly, if you look at Nigel Farage's track record, the man pushed Brexit, which is like by far and wide be one of the single most harmful acts that we've undertaken in this country in terms of the standard of living, in terms of the inflation that we're experiencing, in terms of the fact that we're now completely economically isolated, that our allegedly special relationship with the US has resulted in like one of the worst trade deals I could imagine. Sorry, these are our allies giving us these trade deals. And yet we continuously are being sold this idea that these people, and not to mention the fact that, of course, Farage is himself a millionaire, speaking on behalf of the working class, and somehow that's fine.
But even that whole thing around, Trump's a billionaire. The working class has still voted for him twice.
Right.
So even because I find like the left communication on this is so dreadful, because it's like you're just reading a script. You're just saying it's not about refugees, it's about billionaires, and working class people are sat there saying, well, what about the grooming guys, or what about the asylum?
Right.
Address the issue, meet them where they're at, debunk the myths, and take them with you. Our kind of folk sometimes will just say, you're a racist, you're a fascist, you're a Nazi. Some of them might be, some of them might not be.
Right.
Our job is to bring them to our side, because if you're working class and your living standards are getting worse, it's our job as people who want better for the working class to fight for you.
And also, can we just remind ourselves and everyone that racist is not a permanent identity? That we do have examples of people who were racist,
yes,
and who do subsequently,
I've met many,
decide not to hold on to those views. So this idea that we just dismiss everyone, I'm always very inspired by Huey Newton's example, the Black Panther, who reached out to white nationalists.
Yeah.
as the Black Panthers at the time, also to the Latino communities, to create a broad-based rainbow coalition, which was designed to represent the interests of the working class. And what I love about his story was that those white supremacists who were initially carrying the Confederate flag, which is, again, a dog whistle for, continuing to support essentially slavery in America. I think that would be a fair way to describe how many people interpret the Confederate flag. Decided to drop its use once they started working with the Black Panthers. They suddenly realized, like, oh, actually, these lot are pretty decent, and they kind of get what we're talking about.
Yeah, I want to share a story with you. So
Please.
In 1984, we had the miners' strike, and there was a group in Sheffield called the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement who were organizing in the defense of the Asian community, given the increase in racist attacks. They were very class-conscious people. They were all the children of industrial workers, and they decided that they were going to go to Orgreave, where there was a picket line to stand with the white miners. And so Mukhtar Dar, one of the members, told me a story of how they got the minivan, and there was one of their members called Sadiq. It was 5 a.m. and they were throwing pebbles at his window. He didn't really want to go. And so they dragged him along, and Sadiq comes out, sleep coming out of his eyes. And when they get to the picket line, one of the miners turns around and says, "What the F are the Pakis doing here?" And Sadiq turns to Mukhtar and says, "You got me up at bloody 5 a.m. to come here and get this racism from the miners. Why on earth are we standing with these people for?" And Mukhtar said, "Well, brother, we can see the bars and some of them can't. That just because some of these people have racist views doesn't mean this isn't a community that's being shafted. It doesn't mean they don't have problems with the policing. The policing was very violent, as you know, and the Asians were also facing, violent policing." And he attempted to build links. And when you study the history of the miners' strike, the South Asian communities in Britain donated so much money to support miners. In Handsworth, Birmingham, which was a poor Black and Asian area, the mining lodges used to fight over who gets that patch of funding, because they would always be donating money. The Gurdwaras would be feeding people. They would be feeding white miners. There were very few Asians who worked in the mining communities, but there was this sense of solidarity. And I've interviewed, the families of miners who say that changed their mindset, because all they'd ever seen about Asians was these people are a threat, they're an invasion, they don't integrate. And their first interaction with Asian people was on a picket line or on some kind of fundraising event. So, sometimes when I tell these stories, I get a reaction which says, "Oh, you're a bit naive," or "It's not my job to educate you," is one I often hear now. And I said, okay, fine, if you don't want to do that work, but don't then claim to be some kind of social reformer or some kind of, a person that wants to actually build a movement. Building a movement requires you to try and win people over.
I want to ask you, as a final question, about solutions and about the way we move forward from this moment, because I think it was sadly a historic moment in the negative sense. I am old enough to remember the 2012 Olympics, where we celebrated multiculturalism, where the Britain that we represented on the global stage was one that paid homage to the different peoples who today make up this island and have contributed to it from all sectors of society. And are integral to what people tend to be proud of in this country. The institutions, the academia, the arts, innovation, business, public services, all of those are not due to just a singular group in society. And I'm just wondering, is multiculturalism now just dead?
Malcolm X used to say, "We are not outnumbered, we are out-organized." And I don't think we should allow a big demonstration in London by 110,000 people to determine our view of what Britain is. I believe, and maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm too optimistic, that we do have an anti-racist majority in Britain. I believe, regardless of these far-right narratives, and yes, racism and Islamophobia has been on the rise, Britain is still a better example of multiculturalism in practice than most European countries. I'm very proud of my town. I'm very proud to be mixing with so many different people of different backgrounds and cultures. I love it. I think grime music is as British as the football. And the whole thing around chicken tikka masala, the way you'll hear English people say, "I'm going for a Chinese," or "I'm going for," that is Britain. That is who we are. That is our country, and we should fight for that vision of this country. By the way, I don't think there's I don't think state multiculturalism as a policy is without its criticisms.
Absolutely.
I think often it's been the right who've made the criticisms, but I believe when you think back to what had happened in the 90s and late 80s as well, you had this whole thing around the grant funding. So you had riots in 81 in really poor inner city areas, Toxteth, Handsworth, Southall, Luton had riots as well. And the government approach was, well, we're going to give a bunch of money to like the Muslims, we're going to give it to the Africans. And that was when we started to get this concept of state multiculturalism as a policy, the Greater London Council giving money to all of these different groups. I think that kind of divided us a bit, because before there was this concept of political blackness amongst minorities, that we all face the same racism. It doesn't mean we all have the same experience, but we need to get together and fight together. And you also had this growing sense of kind of class solidarity, that we're all working class. We lost both of those things, and what we were replaced by was this whole concept of atomization and individualism. It's not really about the community anymore, it's about individual success. So we had this great thing around social mobility. Oh look, we've got the first Asian prime minister, we've got the first black leader of the opposition, we've got more black and Asian kids going to top unis. Multiculturalism's great, but actually when you look into the data around black and Asian working class people, there's still a problem. We still have poor housing in Luton, we still have some of the highest rates of child poverty, we still have the decline of industry. And so I believe there's always been this feeling that multiculturalism's worked for some people, but it's not worked for others. And if you're white working class, you must think it's never worked, right? Because you've never felt any better off. So I think everyone has this sense of nostalgia that it used to be great. Remember the 70s when London was great? It wasn't necessarily great. If you look at East London, you had slums. And the people with social mobility moved to towns, ironically, like Epping, which were nicer, satellite towns, and they had a better standard of living. But everyone likes to remember this glorious past when Britain was so great. You know, gangs and knife crime in the early 2000s was huge. There were less cameras. It's not the crime hasn't actually increased in London, but that's where the critiques of multiculturalism are coming from. You've got these accounts like, I think there's one called Yo-K or something, and all they do is they go into diverse communities and pick out like examples of antisocial behavior and say, look, this is multiculturalism, this is immigration. If you go to Cleveland and you go to like Hartlepool and Sunderland, they've got a lot of knife crime there, and it's predominantly white working class kids carrying knives, carrying drugs. But that's not seen as a problem of multiculturalism. That's seen as a problem of the left behind white working class.
Right.
But the black and Asian people, they can never be left behind. They can never be working class. They are just migrants, and that's multiculturalism. So look, I think there are people who say we need to try and think of a new way to bring communities together. I'm all for that. I think we should think of ways to actually bring communities together. And look, there's great initiatives. The mosques do open days and tours, and there's football tournaments that bring people across the town together. But we have to also address who is creating the division, who is spreading misinformation, who is dividing communities. We have to fix the underlying economic concerns that people have, but we also need to address the radicalization element, which is being pushed by these YouTubers, this ecosystem, GB News, Talk TV. That whole infrastructure needs to be dismantled.
Powerful and very wealthy individuals who are funding hate, divisions, and bigotry in order to deflect attention from us all coming together to look upwards and maybe even punch upwards rather than punch down. Taj Ali, thank you so much for making time to talk with us today.
Thanks.
And thank you all for joining us on this episode of The Tea. This is an important conversation, so please do keep it going in the comments below. To stay connected, subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Instagram and TikTok, links in our bio. And as ever, if you want to be a more active participant in the resistance, join us on Patreon, where you'll get exclusives, additional content, and a chance to shape future content. Stay awake, and we'll see you soon for more tea. Thanks for tuning into The Tea. If this episode resonated with you, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And why not dive into these other episodes we think you'll love? Let's keep the conversation going.